Joseph, good morning. It's good to see you again. Hope you are well.
I'm struggling today. I'm struggling and have been since the confirmation of the death of the Bibas family, watching Hamas use the coffins as another staging of propaganda, the forensic confirmation of the two children, and the ultimate taunting of giving a coffin locked without keys containing a body that was not the mother. I cannot begin to fathom what Yardain Bibis, who survived as a hostage, how do you bury your two children and not even know where your wife's remains are? And we are confronted with the eternal text that both of us choose to teach and attempt to explain. I am amazed at the lectionary you sent me and its segue to this week's Torah portion.
Yeah,
So you have
so
this 45, a reconciliation with Joseph. Okay, you didn't like my ego and you threw me in a pit, but God meant it to be good, so you won't starve. Neener, I told you I was better.
yeah, so last week we said that we would talk about the passages from one another's lectionary moving
Right.
forward as a jumping off point. And so let's start. You show me yours, and then we can move to mine. So
So
you have a
Genesis, the Exodus 22 to 25, called Mishpatim, a long list of detailed social communal governance, which includes famous passages, lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, being borrowed from the Mesopotamian law code, always understood to be about equity, never to be understood to be literal, because we'd all be blind and toothless. But there it is. And that one little passage could be the spin-off of how I stand both in awe and terror of the Lucian passage. It is also in Exodus 22:20. Be careful how you treat a stranger. You were a stranger. That's repeated both in, it's a fundamental act, Rawls' veil of ignorance notwithstanding. You have a past, and your past informs your moral code.
yeah. So my translation is: you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were once sojourners in the land of Egypt.
Gerim, strangers. That is the most common way of taking up the Levinausian other. And then immediately following that, the great prophetic, and don't mistreat the widow and the orphan. That category of the most vulnerable, the least among us, the New Testament, the least among us. Well, a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old baby, there isn't a shared common sense. You read that this week and you go, okay, I understand the quagmire of geopolitics, but really, a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old kidnapped and murdered? How does that fit in the structure of anything the Bible wants us to understand? The stranger and the widow and the orphan. And we can't hold on to that?
Well, and it's interesting too that what follows it in Exodus 21 is verse 28. You shall not revile God, as though what comes before it are ways that we revile God, our mistreatment of others, our disregard.
So we go back to last week. Stealing following murder is understood to mean kidnapping, not burglary, not stealing an object, but kidnapping a life. October 7th, those babies were kidnapped. That is not understood to be a basic violation. And I want to know why, what has happened that the world has not cried out in unison. No, this is too far. I'm stuck with the prescience of the text. You were a stranger in a strange land. So be careful how you treat another stranger. Spend lots of time talking about the categories of the marginal. That's what the stranger is. The person we step over on the street, the homeless. Okay, it's still there, but there are elements of what I thought we all shared. And I'm struggling today with my own critical acceptance that we don't all share that. And I'm worried about that, Jason. I'm worried if the simplest, most fundamental categories, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that's a threshold of literal revenge that brings us nowhere. It keeps us in a loop of utter destruction. We must look at the past to know how our ethics should be. But can we accept the widow, the orphan? No. 4-year-olds and 9-month-olds are part of an act of resistance. You kidnap them, and then you murder them, and then you use the return of the coffin, locked without keys.
Well, your Torah portion continues in chapter 23, continues to be timely. This is the English Standard Version. You shall not spread false news. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not take any bribes. Do not kill the innocent and the righteous.
Yeah.
And then again, you shall not oppress a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt.
It's also basic that there are times when I've opened the text and say, yeah, it wasn't revealed, it was written, but behind it is an awareness of something fundamental to being human. And whoever these editors were then convey it through the idea. God said this. Okay. If being fundamental doesn't get your attention, God said it. Okay, God said it. So how do we now hope today with the burden? A Jew and a Christian struggling to hold on to a meaningful text, which we are obligated to share with our congregations.
So put this Torah portion into conversation with the lectionary gospel reading from Luke chapter 6. It follows up.
Luke 6 is even a more beautiful poetic exaggeration of Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. It's the utopian. It's the proleptic, the not yetness of what God will give us. Love your enemy. Love your enemy. When you get slapped, turn the other cheek. I find as beautiful as the Lukean aspiration, that horizon of what can still might yet be.
Well, I think another way it can function too is love your enemy follows right after Jesus issuing a series of woes. And so I think you can hear that as Jesus doing what Paul does in Romans in terms of calling out certain groups of people to elicit self-righteousness from us. And then he hits us with love your enemy so that we're all left in the same spot of falling short.
It's all drawn from Leviticus 19, 18. And we've talked about this before. To love your neighbor as yourself, you must add, don't bear a grudge, don't commit revenge. The imposition of chapter and verse is awkward. Somehow the text puts that into powerful language symmetry. Bearing a grudge and committing revenge. How do you not engage that in these last 48 hours of the return of coffin? And how do we look at that and then say, Luke like Matthew, sees that aspirational messianic horizon. Could you imagine loving that enemy? So there is something in the text that does not yet include the reality of 21st century terrorism. I can't imagine Luke and Matthew trying to describe the intentionality of this kind of indecency.
Well,
I don't want the text to be glossed in a
it's something
way.
something I was thinking about yesterday. I think it's important to remember that as a matter of history, Jesus died with his movement being a failure. That at the end he had no followers. That he lost and he suffered in the losing. And I think there are Christians, at least in America, or self-professed Christians, who, out of a desire to win and achieve certain temporal goals, are willing to run roughshod over the commandments and their baptismal vocation, when in reality we're supposed to be following someone who lost, and therefore, on principle, we should not do whatever it takes to win, if that makes sense. And so we lie and we twist the truth and we castigate others, and and I think Christians in the 21st century struggle two directions. I think we don't have a sense of a common history as Christians in the way that Jews do. Like we don't read this Torah portion and think that we too were once sojourners in the land of Egypt. So we don't have a sense of history that binds us to a way of life. And then I think there's a lot of despair about the future too, such that it's easy to justify eating and drinking and being merry now.
Absolutely. I can understand being pushed into the corner of such agony and indifference. Hedonism makes sense. I get it. How could any of us, even for a few minutes of Rawlsian intellectual curiosity?
You've thrown John Rawls' name around a few times this morning, so introduce us for those who don't know.
A great and important philosopher, American, the theory of justice and the idea that we have a veil of ignorance that prevents us from any kind of bias, and that we would be able to look at some ethical demand without looking back. I never liked it. I don't think it helps us in the daily quagmire of ethical confusion. How do we create a question of migrants as a new category of people to be disdained, hated, feared? Yes, we require more control, and it's not as simple as let anyone come in, as the Statue of Liberty suggests. But here it is. Remember that you were strangers in a strange land. That's the cornerstone of this Torah portion. How you treat others is an anchor of your past. There's no Sinai without Egypt. There's no ultimate ethical imperative without the suffering of the 10 plagues. So here we are, stuck in Israel and Gaza, horrified at an unending threshold of anger and rage and terrorism. And we all need to imagine what it would be like to be the father of those two children who was a hostage, and they were just kidnapped from their kibbutz. How do we get out of that? Where are we as human beings? A group that gets pushed to the edge, and its only purpose is the extermination of another community. We've got a challenge that God gave us already as simply as Joseph. Okay, you're here. I brought you here, and I now want to know how my father is. That's his first question. How's Dad? I would like to share the messianic sense of transcendent hope in Luke. And I can't right now. How do a Jew and a Christian who want to work in a shared vineyard, how do we find a way to not just share scripture, but share in the obligated struggle of what this scripture requires of both of us? I reject lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I don't even know how it worked in ancient Mesopotamia. Equity seems to have been abused so much that we're not allowed to even use that word right now, Jason. That word has been washed from lots of websites. Okay, you hurt me. What do I do with that hurt? Is there any recompense for what you've done to me? I'm amazed that the text understood this in such a sophisticated way, both in the narrative of Joseph, in the listing of law, and then finally in the uplifting aspiration of think about loving your enemy.
And maybe the lectionary psalm kind of cuts through some of the tension. Psalm 37, do not fret because of the wicked, do not be envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, live in the land and enjoy security. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. He will make your vindication shine like the light, and the justice of your cause like the noonday. Be still before the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Do not fret over those who prosper in their way, over those who carry out evil devices. That's a much smaller scale, I think, that all Jason or Joseph can do is to not be consumed with anxiety about the wicked, and to trust in the Lord and do good with what's in front of us.
Yes, I appreciate that calming threshold. But I also read the last two verses of Psalm 137, which are horrifying. There by the waters of Babylon, there I sat and wept after they taunted me. And, okay, today traditional Jews are praying for the avenging of the martyrs. May God avenge their death. I don't want to be in relationship with a God to whom I pray for vengeance.
Well, it's because I've been doing a sermon series on Psalm 23. It's been in my head that the patristic interpretation of the Psalms is that Jesus is the supplicant at all of the Psalter. And so I think it's astonishing for Christians to imagine what it means that Jesus, with Israel gathered around him, prays for Babylon's babies to be dashed against their rocks.
Mm-hmm.
That we're not, it adds complexity to how we imagine who Jesus is.
And in 23, there is that one word that seems to be somehow corrupted, salmavet, shadow of death. Well, it could be selem mavet, in which the letter mem is doubled, not shadow, but image, selem, image.
My friend and former classmate Chris Hughes wrote a very long academic essay on this that got cut from the sermon.
And that might be where we're stuck. We're stuck because we have images of death. If you play Warcraft, if you engage in the visualizing, which trivializes death, okay, you got an image. I don't know how you live in Israel today and how you get rid of the burden of October 7th. And coffins are returned. We don't yet have coffins of those who were murdered on October 7th and their bodies kept for the leverage.
I think part of what you're saying there, it's not just that the commandment is against making graven images of God because God is beyond visual grasp. It's that images have power over us.
Correct. Which is why ancient biblical Israelite faith was so radical. It was not just an unseen, unseeable God. It was an unseen, unseeable God, which was the source of everything you see. I mean, talk about not merely anti-polytheism, anti-idolatry. I'm going to work at the very core of how you know something as a human being. You see it. Well, you can't see me, but we have seen death. And I don't know whether it's the shadow of death or the image of death. I don't want to lose Matthew and Luke. I need the Sermon on the Mount as something which inherently is shared. That comes from how Jesus was able to teach his understanding of Torah. We were strangers and we lived by a moral code which depended on our empathy to the stranger. Don't ignore the widow and the orphan. What kind of society begins with creating that as the margin of vulnerability? That's amazing. I mean, yes, of course. How do we retrieve the power of those simple but obvious ethical imperatives? I think if you ignore those, by the time you get to false news, no, you're a dictator. You actually attacked the Ukraine.
Yeah.
What? It's dizzying. And I like your turn to Psalm 37 as a way to make us sit down because we are dizzy. We're not stable. And help us. Can we be patient enough to rely on what God will do to the evil? I don't know. That's a profound structure of hope. Does what we witness over the last 48 hours. I cannot fathom human beings who murder 4-year-old and 9-month-old babies. I don't know what that means. I think I've said in the past to you that the Nazis asked I.G. Farben to help them understand the most efficient, the quickest, the least expensive way to exterminate the most people. And the report came back and said it is cheaper, quicker, more efficient to put a live infant in the crematory rather than spend what would then have been 2/5 of a cent to gas it first.
This was the German Doge.
Yes. So there it is. It isn't that human beings have not put live infants in fire before. But here was the pinnacle of a society that was cost-effective and efficient in determining, and they thought about it. They thought about it. And that's the product of what they thought about. And what horrifies me about the last 48 hours is this was thought about. We're going to put another body in this coffin, but give it back to them to continue to torment them. We have the mother. Right? Is Psalm 37, is it aware of the evil that some people do? Or have we in the 21st century created something that was not yet evil enough for the psalm to convey? Is the Lucian messianic aspiration, does that idiom love your enemies, is that enemy inclusive of Hamas? Or do we have a moment here in which we say the text can't hold that?
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of the New Testament, I think Luke 6 has to be read in submission to Paul in Romans, that while we were yet enemies, Christ died for us. The Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain can easily become sentimental
Very good. Yes.
or self-righteous, woe to you who are rich.
Mhm.
But I think, so for Christians at least, you have to subsume those commands underneath Paul's understanding of the gospel that takes sin so seriously it requires the death of God.
The Torah portion gives us in chapter 24 something quite profound, which is they wrote it down. That this was Sefer HaBrit. Again, so extraordinary. They wrote it down so they could read it again. And here we are reading it again. And that really strikes me as the reminder of what it means to be religious today. Not a piety of liturgy, but the risk-taking of struggling with the text.
Yeah, and probably there's where Jews and Christians and where Protestants and Catholics part ways, this Torah portion ends with people saying to Moses several times, all of this we will do. And of course, very little of it do we do.
But in 24/7, I just need to make sure we talk about this strange double idiom. The people said, we'll do it and understand it. This is one of the greatest little phrases in all Jewish tradition. And the order is, we'll do it and then understand it. Normally, human beings work with, we'll understand it and then do it. Here, the understanding only comes from the experience of doing.
So they're habituated virtues.
It's counterintuitive. Have the faith, do it, and in the action, you will then come to understand it. I'm not asking for your understanding and agreement. I'm asking for your engagement. And I think we have to do that every single day. All of this right now in the chaos we're all experiencing, and each of us differently. Okay, am I going to keep this up or just step away out of it's more than I can handle? Na'aseh v'nishma. It's the doing that will initiate the belief, the understanding, the agreement. So
And I think
the dialogue, the conversation.
I think what one of the other lectionary passages is from 1 Corinthians 15. It's this long argument about the resurrection. But it ends with Paul reminding us that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And so I think, at least in the church, there are a lot of, very often, something like the Sermon on the Plain or the Sermon on the Mount is presented as blueprints, strategy, instructions for how we build the kingdom. And the New Testament clearly rules that out, that we cannot inherit that. Only from God's side can that happen.
Numbers 13 and 14 often just simply overlooked. The 12 spies, 10 come back saying, oh, we look like grasshoppers. And they're only Joshua and Caleb. And it was that failure to believe in their own destiny. They didn't know they were 3 days away from the border. And that's why the generation that was freed, crossed the Sea of Reeds, stood at Mount Sinai, that generation has to die. And another generation has to live. We've got to believe in the destiny. We've got to be present to each other in the differences with which we understand that destiny. That's where the struggle is right now. I don't want to capitulate to the torment of terrorism or the swirling chaos of our democracy. And we get caught between the forces of the transcendent and the seeming absence of the immanent. Tough times to be a pastor, a rabbi, looking at the text and admitting to the flock, I don't know how to teach this. I want to teach it. I want it. But the world in which we're living is pushing against the word. Please, I hope Christians understand that mishpatim, which so easily could be caught up in, see Jews just are concerned with rules, laws. It's a long list of things that don't have any relevance. I've tried to give you some of the best of what I would teach that remain classic, a permanent surplus meaning.
Well, yeah. I mean, I, I, I don't know that people, other ancient religions did not tell you how to live. No one in Rome went to a temple dedicated to Zeus, say, with an offering, expecting Zeus to tell him or her that they have obligations to their neighbor. That God's moral intent is what made Judaism distinct.
Yes, and it's a lesson Jews at every threshold of power must continue to struggle with. I don't want us as a community to flip on the slope of rage. We need help in upholding the hope, and it's good to be in dialogue with a Christian who still sustains the Lucian hope. Difficult for me to hear, but a gift to be in dialogue with it.
I feel like half my congregation is filled with anger right now over the new administration, and the other half is angry that people are angry. It's easy to lose your bearings in that kind of swirl.
And even if we could just go back and say, how do we discuss this? You were once strangers, so remember that in how you treat a stranger. How do we discuss that? The burden?
And I do think what Christians can learn from Jews is, aside from modern Israel, it's been a really long time since Jews were in control of any country. And I think, Christians in America have kind of thought of Christianity being the default established religion of the United States. And now that pretense is gone. And so I think it's time. It's a pressing time for Christians to think about how to be Christian in a country that does not share its convictions.
Yes.
How do we separate out the Christian we and the American we, as Herawas might say?
I would like to know where the widow and orphan are in the dismantling of U.S. aid.
I have a couple of my former youth were contractors whose work was just stopped immediately.
And it will all be in very clear calculation as tax cuts are brought to the new budget. Here's what I'm giving you to justify what I need from you. And that's what I think Mishpatim is about. This is so obvious, I need to mention it.
But I think it's also, so this is part of a covenant, even certainly in the Sermon on the Mount, less so the Sermon on the Plain, but in Matthew, Jesus gathers the crowd on the Mount of Beatitudes, but it's clear that he's speaking to his disciples, and everyone else is over. And so you have the sense with Jesus too that it's about a covenant, those who've chosen to follow him. And I think Christians need to do a better job of holding one another to account, and worry less about, say, Donald Trump's behavior. And so that's why I've just been thinking about, I read some lectures that Bonhoeffer did on 1 Timothy 1937 in Germany. And he really zeroes in on Paul talking to Timothy about the danger posed by false teachers. And I think, Christians need to get their own house in order, I think, before they try to make the world come out right.
We all need to stop, be very quiet, make sure we know where too much is happening, we're dizzy, and we need to be aware. This happened. A coffin was returned in which the remains were not the mother.
I think, I was just curious on, so the story about the Beavis children and the mother is, I have to scroll halfway down the homepage of the Washington Post to get to it. And so I think one of the consequences of Donald Trump flooding the zone with shit is that important stories don't get the attention that they deserve.
Don't
Which
know
also
what
has a
shame.
numbing effect.
Yes. What could we all determine to be beyond intolerable? I don't know how to manage that conversation. It's not a mistake. It's an intentional human act to torment other human beings. And that should impact us. And I think that's what all these texts remain. They remain there to make us stop and think. Wow.
Yeah.
We were all strangers. The widow and the orphan is not a left-wing progressive category. It's not even a prophetic category. There it is. Exodus, long list of rules. And to stop and wonder about that. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
what's really offended me the last few days is seeing the number of Christians on social media pivoting to justify the U.S. now switching sides and supporting Russia for all intents and purposes without any seriousness about the number of children that Putin has stolen. If nothing else, the scriptures demand a seriousness about sin that is not as present as it should be.
Well, I bless you in your ability to preach about this.
Well, I mean, I'm preaching on the 23rd Psalm.
Did the music I sent you help?
Yes. Yeah, I wasn't sure how it would go to spend all of the Epiphany season on a single psalm, but it's gone well.
Good. Next week, Truma. Fascinating. The building of the tabernacle.
That'll be good. Yeah, for us, it's the Transfiguration.
Yep. Lots of wonderful realities. I'm going to give you physicality in ways you can't replicate.
Well, you have a good day, sir.
You too. Thank you for the engagement.
Yeah.